Chapter 4. Friend and Associates. Of friends, in the usual sense of the term, John Nelson Darby had few. It was, however, well nigh impossible but that his dominant personality and ardent devotion to our blessed Lord should attract like-minded persons, and also others who were temporarily fascinated by the savour of Christ and the primeval freshness of Darby's teaching, and yet failed to renounce the world and reduce that doctrine to a life of obedience. We select 7 typical examples of these friends or associates of John Nelson Darby, but the reader will not, we trust, suspect any esoteric meaning to lie in the numeral selected. Professor Francis William Newman, Benjamin Wills Newton, J.C. Philpott, Dr. Edward Cronin, George V. Wigram, George Muller, and William Kelly were all at one time friends of Mr. Darby, or at any rate very intimately associated with him. Almost every writer on Darby has felt it incumbent upon him to incorporate in his narrative Professor Newman's striking pen portrait and appraisal of John Nelson Darby. Some may consider its value to be enhanced by the ground occupied by Newman when writing the notorious Phases of Faith, from which it is taken. Professor Francis William Newman, brother of Cardinal Newman, was associated with Mr. Darby in rather early days, but, alas, widely drifted from the early teaching. He had won an unusually high double first class at Oxford and became resident tutor at Sergeant Pennefather's. Here he saw much of Mr. Darby, who was there invalided. But ere long, after a brief missionary journey to the East in company with Mr. A.N. Groves and others, he returned to England and lapsed into a form of scepticism or deism, at least as soon as Mr. Darby's personal influence was withdrawn. His reminiscences of those early days are interesting and are here given. He says, "After taking my degree, I became a fellow of Balliol College, and the next year I accepted an invitation to Ireland, and there became private tutor for 15 months in the house of one now deceased, whose name I would gladly mention for honour and affection, but I withhold my pen. While he paid me munificently for my services, he behaved towards me as a father, or indeed as an elder brother, and instantly made me feel as a member of his family. His great talents, high professional standing, nobleness of heart, and unfeigned piety would have made him a most valuable counsellor to me. But he was too gentle, too unassuming, too modest. He looked to be taught by his juniors, and sat at the feet of one whom I proceed to describe. This was a young relative of his, a most remarkable man, who rapidly gained an immense sway over me. I shall henceforth call him the Irish clergyman. His bodily presence was indeed weak. A fallen cheek, a bloodshot eye, crippled limbs resting on crutches, a seldom shaved beard, a shabby suit of clothes, and a generally neglected person, drew at first pity, with wonder to see such a figure in a drawing-room. It was currently reported that a person in Limerick offered him a halfpenny, mistaking him for a beggar, and if not true, the story was yet well invented. This young man had taken high honours at Dublin University, and had studied for the bar, where, under the auspices of his eminent kinsman, he had excellent prospects, but his conscience would not allow him to take a brief, lest he should be selling his talents to defeat justice. With keen logical powers, he had warm sympathy, solid judgment of character, thoughtful tenderness, and total self-abandonment. He before long took holy orders and became an indefatigable curate in the mountains of Wicklow. Every evening he sallied forth to teach in the cabins, and roving far and wide over mountains and amid bogs, was seldom home before midnight. By such exertions his strength was undermined, and he so suffered in his limbs that not lameness only, but yet more serious results were feared. He did not fast on purpose. He did fast, often on purpose, for neither display nor influence. But his long walks through wild country and amongst indigent people afflicted on him much more severe privation. Moreover, as he ate whatever food offered itself, food unpalatable and often indigestible to him, his whole frame might have vied in emaciation with a monk of La Trappe. Such a phenomenon intensely excited the poor Romanists, who looked on him as a genuine saint of the ancient breed. The stamp of heaven seemed to them clear, in a frame so wasted by austerity, so superior to worldly pomp, and so partaking in all their indigence. That a dozen such men would have done more to convert all Ireland to Protestantism and the whole apparatus of the church establishment was ere long my conviction. Though I was at first offended by his personal affectation of a careless exterior, never was there a greater mistake. It was his unworldly principle and practice. But soon I understood that in no other way could he gain equal access to the lowest orders, and that he was moved, not by asceticism nor by ostentation, but by a self-abandonment fruitful of consequences. He had practically given up all reading but the Bible, and no small part of his movement soon took the form of dissuasion from all other voluntary study. In fact, I had myself more and more concentrated my religious reading on this one book. Still, I could not help feeling the value of a cultivated mind. Against this, my new eccentric friend, having himself enjoyed no mean advantages of cultivation, directed his keenest attacks. I remember once saying to him, "To desire to be rich is absurd, but if I were a father of children, I should wish to be rich enough to secure them a good education." He replied, "If I had children, I would as soon see them break stones on the road as do anything else, if I could only secure them to the gospel and the grace of God." I was unable to say Amen, but I admired his unflinching consistency. For now, as always, all he said was based on texts aptly quoted and logically enforced. He made me more and more ashamed of political economy and moral philosophy and all science, all of which ought to be counted dross for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus our Lord. For the first time in my life I saw a man earnestly turning into reality the principles which others professed with their lips only. Never before had I seen a man so resolved that no word of the New Testament should be a dead letter to him. I once said, "But do you really think that no part of the New Testament may have been temporary in its object? For instance, what would we have lost if St. Paul had never written, 'The cloak that I left at Troas, bring with thee and the books, but especially the parchments'?" He answered with the greatest promptitude, "I should have lost something, for it was exactly that verse which alone saved me from selling my little library. No, every word, depend upon it, is from the Spirit and is for eternal service." In spite of the strong revulsion which I felt against some of the peculiarities of this remarkable man, I, for the first time in my life, found myself under the domination of a superior. When I remember how even those bowed down before him had been in the place of parents, accomplished and experienced minds, I cease to wonder, in the retrospect, that he riveted me in such a bondage. Even an apostle's prayer, Ephesians 3, could not keep the Ephesian church from losing her first love, and the powerful influence for good of Darby did not prevent Newman from gliding out into the darkness of agnosticism. But we must leave him to his God and pass on to give a brief notice of another remarkable man, an Oxford fellow, Mr. J.C. Philpott, M.A., who was also at one time resident tutor at the Pennefathers. He knew Mr. Darby when he emerged out of the depths after 7 years of bitter exercise into perfect peace with God. As Mr. Philpott belonged to the extreme school of hyper-Calvinistic Baptists, he naturally appreciated Mr. Darby's trial of spirit, but not so his subsequent happiness. Yet he testified in the Earthen Vessel of that day that Darby was generous to the wasting of his substance and possessed of more than martyr courage. Mr. Benjamin Wills Newton and J.N. Darby first met at Oxford in 1830, where Newton was Fellow of Exeter College. Of his character, some suggestive words of the late C.H. Spurgeon are illuminative. He says that in manner and spirit Mr. Newton is far removed from the Darby school. He was a scholarly man of grave, sober manners and of very considerable influence over a certain class, especially people of leisure. He was one of the earlier labourers at Providence Chapel, Plymouth, but almost from the first was observed to court isolation and to hold aloof from other labouring brethren. He held Bible readings and would not allow other labouring brethren to be present, saying it was bad for the taught to hear the authority of the teacher called into question, as it shook confidence in him. Mr. Darby says, "I sorrowed over this unhappy trait of isolation and love of acting alone and having followers for himself. I had no suspicion of any purpose of any kind, and bore with it as a failing, of which we all had some. I should not have so acted without my brethren. I should have rejoiced to have my views corrected by them when I needed it, and learn theirs, but there it was, and there I left it." At a meeting in Clifton, Mr. Newton, speaking of ministry and points connected with it, told me, said Mr. Darby, that his principles were changed. I replied that mine were not, that I felt I had received them from the Lord's teaching, and with his grace should hold them fast to the end. At a later date, he advanced a peculiar heterodoxy, which seemed the fruit of his prophetic speculation in making Christ have the experience of an unconverted Israelite, in order to sympathize with a future Jewish remnant in that state. It is singular that it was in resisting the error of Edward Irving, Newton himself fell into a modified and subtle Irvingism. But there were others very different from the foregoing. One who was even earlier than John Nelson Darby in learning Christian liberty, ecclesiastical and ministerial, but only in the germ and much simplicity, was Edward Cronin, afterwards the last Canterbury M.D. By birth a Roman Catholic, he early came under the rough and ready discipline of his bishop. It was in Cork that this Roman shepherd, finding Cronin reading a Protestant copy of the Scriptures, actually knocked him down on the spot, and thus served to open the door for escape. He proceeded to Dublin as a medical student, and here learnt from his study of the Bible that Christendom was very anomalous, and very sturdily refused to join himself to any sect. He was allowed to take the communion in the Lord's name by the Independents for a while, but later was excluded because he declined to become a member of their church like the rest. God gave him soon afterwards to take the simple Christian stand. His memory is revered by many to this day. After a long life of devotion and fidelity to the Lord and his people, he passed away in 1882 to be with him whom he had devotedly loved and served. His end was more than peace, for constantly upon his lips was the name of the Lord, and almost his latest utterance was the well-known verse, "Glory, honour, praise and power be unto the Lamb for ever. Jesus Christ is my Redeemer. Hallelujah, praise ye the Lord." Mr. G. V. Wigram, a later associate and intimate friend of Mr. Darby, first met the latter at Oxford in the year 1831, when Mr. Darby was visiting that city. Though never great as a writer or a speaker, Mr. Wigram was characterized by a singular spirituality and devotedness, by decision where Christ was concerned and love for his flock. Together with his moral power, these gave him a justly very high place in the esteem of J.N. Darby and many others. His chief published works were the Englishman's Hebrew and Chaldee Concordance to the Old Testament, and a cognate one to the Greek New Testament. Another with whom John Nelson Darby came for a while into association was Mr. George Muller of Bristol. At one time we find Mr. Muller writing of 2 Swiss brethren who have learned the way of truth more perfectly through our brother John Darby. And during the winter of 1843-44 there occurs in his correspondence the following: "There is one brother among us who through dear John Darby learned the way of God more perfectly in Switzerland," showing thereby the fellowship in and appreciation of Mr. Darby's labours felt by Mr. Muller at this period. Would that it might have so continued, but alas, history repeats itself in the ecclesiastical sphere as surely as in the secular. Hence, before many months passed, we find, if we may be allowed to say, Paul again withstanding Peter because he was to be blamed. In apostolic times it was pretty evident who was at fault, and if Christ himself and his honour had been equally paramount in his servants' lives, this sad spectacle would not have been exhibited either at Antioch in the 1st or Bristol in the 19th century. Mr. Darby last saw Mr. Muller in July 1849, and they never met again on earth. But the greatest of John Nelson Darby's friends, one who appeared at a considerably later date, was a man singularly like-minded with himself, and truly taught of God in the same school, for everything that was best in John Nelson Darby's teaching and practice found its ablest exponent and advocate in the late Mr. William Kelly of Blackheath, London. He has been the subject of frequent suggestive comments from the pen of the late C. H. Spurgeon, who, in his Commenting and Commentaries of the College series, refers to Mr. Kelly in the following terms: first, as a leading writer of the exclusive Plymouth school; secondly, as an eminent divine of the Brethren school, who sometimes expounds ably, but with a twist towards the peculiar dogmas of his party. In the third instance he remarks, "We are sorry to see such a mind as Mr. Kelly's so narrowed to party bounds." Fourthly, it is a pity that a man of such excellence should allow a very superior mind to be so warped. And lastly, he speaks of him as a man who, born for the universe, has narrowed his mind by Darbyism. He was an intimate fellow worker of Mr. Darby and revised his synopsis of the Bible, besides editing his other writings, English, French, German, Dutch and Italian, in some 30 to 40 volumes. Mr. Kelly did not, however, blindly follow his eminent friend or approve all his ecclesiastical actions, and it is extremely difficult to say which was the greater of these two men whose lives were so closely interwoven for a quarter of a century. One trait of Mr. Darby's character, often completely overlooked and quite unsuspected, save by the recipient, which astonished Mr. Philpott in earlier days and Mr. W. Kelly, who informed me of it in later times, was his wonderful generosity. He was as diligent in applying the practical scriptures to himself as in insisting upon those which are considered more purely ecclesiastical. He was not a professional philanthropist, but his kindly thoughtfulness for his poorer brethren, both in temporal and spiritual need, was most marked. Mr. Darby possessed to a wonderful degree the faculty of remembering the names and faces of those who had once come under his notice, frequently surprising people thereby. His patience with honest ignorance, his ready tact, his manliness of character, and hearty sympathy endeared him to many, especially amongst the poorer classes. A poor man who had been unable to make a livelihood in England but anticipated better things in America was hindered from emigrating through lack of funds. This was mentioned to Mr. Darby, who, after due inquiry, presented the astonished man with a cheque for £15 to pay his expenses. Just then the man's circumstances improved, and he decided to stay in England. On his returning the cheque, Mr. Darby said, "So you are not going now? Never mind. If you should want it, come to me again." This is but an example of that practical Christianity which was conspicuous in J.N.D, but should be characteristic of all who follow him who came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. Neatby, in his garbled history of the Plymouth Brethren, says, "If he, Darby, was ruthless in his ecclesiastical conflicts, he had at other times a singularly kindly and sympathetic nature. In the act of addressing a meeting, he would roll up his greatcoat as a pillow for a sleeping child whose uncomfortable attitude had struck him. I have heard that on one of his numerous voyages he might have been seen pacing the deck all night with a restless child in his arms in order to afford the worn-out mother an opportunity of rest, and I doubt whether many children were more tenderly nursed that night. The incident is the more interesting for the fact that Darby was never married. Was it the breaking forth of this tenderness, deep hidden in his lonely heart, that bound men to him in so pathetic a fidelity of devotion? No wonder that they loved him.